The title of tonight's sermon, Providence, God's Care for Mankind. I mentioned that just one Sunday night a month I'd like to preach a sermon on the providence of God. Had one last month and now the one tonight. In 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7, Peter said, "Casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you." You cannot define the providence of God without using the word care. God's care for man. The Bible is the story of God's dealings with man and his care for man. Genesis chapter 1 and verse 26, God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness." Before there was ever the Jewish nation, before it had ever been born, then you have God's care for mankind, as God created man in the very beginning. The Bible relates accounts of God's care, then, for all mankind. Now, we often think of the special care that God had for the Jewish nation. Because the Christ would come into the world, he would be of the seed of Abraham. So we read in the Old Testament scriptures about God's foresight. And in an introductory sermon on providence, we said foresight is part of the definition of providence. And so we see God's foresight with reference to the Israelites and their needs. And he exercised control, this Creator did, over all that he had in order to provide for the nation of Israel. But there are numerous examples in the Old Testament of God's care for Gentiles. Now, I'll have another sermon, and that probably will come next month. God's care for Israel. And we'll look at different examples like Joseph and Esther. But now, some non-Jews. Examples of God's care for people who were not of the land of Israel. And that ought to be of special interest to us because we're Gentiles. We're not of the Jewish nation. We are spiritual Jews now. Galatians 6:16. We are the Israel of God, being the church. No distinction between Jews and Gentiles, but God's care for all of us. All right, the first example that I want us to think about tonight is that of Rahab. In Joshua chapter 2, we will begin there. And in Joshua chapter 2, beginning with verse 1, it says, "Now Joshua, the son of Nun, sent out 2 men from Acacia Grove to spy secretly, saying, 'Go view the land, especially Jericho.' So they went and came to the house of a harlot named Rahab and lodged there. And it was told the king of Jericho, saying, 'Behold, men have come here tonight from the children of Israel to search out the country.' So the king of Jericho sent to Rahab, saying, 'Bring out the men who have come to you, who have entered your house, for they have come to search out all the country.' Then the woman took the 2 men and hid them." And I want us to drop down to verses 8 through 11, and we're going to see here a statement of her faith. It says in Joshua 2, verse 8, "Now before they lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men, 'I know that the Lord has given you the land, that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land are faint-hearted because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you.'" Here's a woman who's giving her testimony of faith, and it was based on her own ear witness of the facts. And we've heard what God has done, the God of Israel, what the God of Israel has done for you. He dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came up out of Egypt. And what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. And as soon as we heard these things, our hearts melted, neither did there remain any more courage in anyone because of you. Notice this, for the Lord your God, she said, the Lord your God, He is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. Well, we see her faith in the God of the Jews. But Rahab, she combined her faith with action. She hid the two spies until she knew that it was safe for them to escape. Now, what chance of survival would she have? As God was about to destroy the city of Jericho, and we read about that in Joshua chapter 6. She had been an immoral woman in an immoral city. She was a resident of a wicked city that God was about to destroy. What chance could she have of survival? But God noticed her. Out of all the other Canaanite women, and she was not a Jew, she was a Canaanite woman. God took note of her faith, and rewarded her faith. First of all, God provided her with deliverance from the destruction of the city. As you go to Joshua chapter 6, of course you know about Joshua 6. Here the Israelites were told what to do, to take the city, and part of it was that they were to march around the city walls one time each day for 6 days. Seventh day, they were to march around the walls of the city 7 times. The walls would fall down flat. They would go into the city and take it. All right, now Joshua 6, verse 24. All that has been done. And now Joshua 6:24, but they burned the city and all that was in it, with fire. Verse 25 says, and Joshua spared Rahab the harlot, her father's household, and all that she had. So she dwells in Israel to this day, because she hid the messengers from whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. Well, God provided her with salvation, provided her with deliverance from that destruction. But here's something else that God provided, and I'm going to use that word provided a lot intentionally, because I mentioned in another sermon on Providence that if you look at that word providence and you just cover up the last 3 letters, then you have the word provide. And so when we talk about God's providence, we're talking about God providing. And so there's the idea of care, concern, foresight, exercise of what control we have in order to provide for those whom we care about. All right, God provided for Rahab. And God provided not only salvation for her, but He provided her with honor by allowing her to be of the lineage of Jesus Christ. What an honor that is, to be there in the first few verses of Matthew chapter 1. Her name is there. It says in Matthew 1, verse 1, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And then you skip on down to verse 5, and there's her name. A woman who had been a prostitute in a wicked city. But later she came to have faith in God and acted on that faith so that God provided her with honor. And part of that honor was she's part of the genealogical record. Part of the genealogy of Jesus Christ. And you think about the Jewish names that were there in Matthew chapter 1. David, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Rahab. Her name right there with theirs. God provided. All right. Somebody says, well, boy, you didn't talk much about her. There's a whole lot to be said. Well, there is, but I've got 5 different examples. And so we can't take a long time with any one of them. All right, the second example would be that of Ruth. As we turn to the book of Ruth, chapter 1, and going to be reading a couple of the most read verses, I guess, in the book of Ruth. Ruth 1, verses 16 and 17. And Ruth, this Moabite woman, expressed her commitment to the God of Israel. Now here was Naomi. Naomi was a Jew. And she escaped the famine that was in Judah, along with her husband, Elimelech, and their 2 sons. They traveled to Moab. And while they were there, the 2 sons, they married Moabite women, and one of them was Ruth. Now, those 2 sons died. And so did Elimelech, Naomi's husband. Naomi gets word that God has provided, there's Providence again, God has provided for Israel. In fact, you have that in Ruth chapter 1 and verse 6. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. The word visited, God visited his people by giving them bread. The footnote in my Bible says attended to. That is, God cared. He exercised foresight and control to give them bread. In other words, the famine is over. There's relief from the famine. But I'm not talking to you now about how God provided for Israel by giving them bread. I'm talking to you how God provided for this Moabite woman by the name of Ruth. Now, Naomi decided, since the famine is over, she's going to go back to Judah. She tries to encourage her daughters-in-law to just stay behind. Just stay with your own people. She said, I don't have any more sons for you. There's no need for you to travel with me. And so just stay where you are. Ruth said, not doing it. I'm going with you. And she expressed her commitment to Naomi in Ruth 1, 16 and 17. It says, but Ruth said, entreat me not to leave you or turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go. And wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Notice that. Here was this Moabite woman, Ruth, who said to her mother-in-law, your God's going to be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. The Lord do so to me. The Lord is mentioned by her. The Lord said, the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. No stronger expressions of loyalty and commitment to another human being than what you have right here in Ruth 1, 16, 17. In fact, those words are used quite a bit in marriage ceremonies due to the loyalty and the commitment that they express. But here she expresses her commitment not only to her mother-in-law, but her commitment to the God of Israel. And she served God faithfully, and God saw that. And God rewarded her faith and her devotion to Him, though she was not of the land of Israel. Now, they returned, or Naomi returned to Judah. Ruth, being committed to her, went with her to the land of Judah. And God provided for Ruth while she was there. God, you remember the story how God provided her with daily food. How she got a job in Boaz's field. You think about here, these 2 women who are on their own. Their husbands have died. And we might again ask, what chance would they have for survival? 2 women on their own. But God provided. God provided her with a job. She works in that field. she's allowed to glean heads of grain in Boaz's field. And then God provided her with a good husband by the name of Boaz, who was a near kinsman of Naomi. And then God provided her with a son. And so you look now at Ruth chapter 4, verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And when he went into her, the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Notice it says there, the Lord gave her conception. The Lord did it. I wonder if we don't talk as much as we should about what the Lord does and what the Lord does for us. I wonder if maybe we need to do that a little bit more than we do. And you find it throughout the Scriptures where people who were servants of God said, this is what the Lord has done. And so here it says, it was the Lord who gave her conception. She bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a close relative, and may his name be famous in Israel. And then in verse 17, it says, also the neighbor women gave him a name, saying, there is a son born to Naomi, and they called his name Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. So just like Rahab was blessed, was provided by God with the honor of being in the genealogical record of Jesus Christ, the Savior of the world, so it is that this Moabite woman, Ruth, was provided with that same honor. Ruth was the great-grandmother of King David. I'll say that again. Ruth was the great-grandmother of King David. And so then you have her name there in the same verse that you have Rahab's name. Matthew 1, verse 5. The genealogical record of Jesus Christ. All right, a third example. The widow of Zarephath. Now, notice what God did for this poor widow. As I'm turning now in my Bible to 1 Kings chapter 17. Notice what God did for this poor widow who thought that she was about to die for lack of food. And she was going to eat the last meal that she would ever eat, she thought. All right, now, 1 Kings chapter 17, beginning with verse 8, going through verse 16. Then the word of the Lord came to him, that is the prophet Elijah, saying, arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. See, I have commanded a widow there to provide for you. Now there's our word, the word provide, having to do with the providence of God. God would provide for Elijah through this Gentile woman, but God would also provide for this Gentile woman. And we're going to read that right here. It says in verse 10, so he arose and went to Zarephath, and when he came to the gate of the city, indeed a widow was there gathering sticks. And he called to her and said, please bring me a little water in a cup that I may drink. And as she was going to get it, he called to her and said, please bring me a morsel of bread in your hand. So she said, as the Lord your God lives, I do not have bread. And here's this Gentile woman who again acknowledged God as the Lord God, the one who lives. And so she said, as the Lord your God lives, I do not have bread, only a handful of flour in a bin and a little oil in a jar. And see, I am gathering a couple of sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. She said, I only have a little bit of food. You're wanting food, but I only have a little bit of food which I will prepare as a final meal. I'm preparing this food as a final meal for me and my son. And Elijah said to her, Do not fear. Go and do as you have said, but make me a small cake from it first, and bring it to me. And afterward make some for yourself and your son. For thus says the Lord God of Israel, the bin of flour shall not be used up, nor shall the jar of oil run dry, until the day the Lord sends rain on the earth. So she went away and did according to the word of Elijah. You see, just like the other two women, she acted on her faith. She did according to the word of the prophet Elijah. And she and he and her household ate for many days. The bin of flour was not used up, nor did the jar of oil run dry, according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke. Now, Jesus, as we go to the New Testament, Luke chapter 4, he commented on this. What we just read there, Jesus commented on it. I want us to notice what he said. In Luke chapter 4, and in verses 25 and 26, Jesus said, "But I tell you truly, many widows were in Israel in the days of Elijah, when the heaven was shut up 3 years and 6 months, and there was a great famine throughout all the land. But to none of them was Elijah sent except to Zarephath in the region of Sidon, to a woman who was a widow." Well, during that time, there were a lot of widows in the land of Israel, he said. Now, didn't God care about those widows who were in the land of Israel? Well, yes, we said that we see it at every turn. At every turn in the Bible, you see that God cared for the needy of the land of Israel. He provided for them. But he also cared for this widow, even though she didn't live in the land of Israel. Even though she was not a Jew, God provided for this widow. And you'll notice that it says in verse 26 that Elijah was sent to her. Elijah was sent to this woman. Who sent her? Well, God sent her. God provided for this widow who was a Gentile through his prophet. So, example after example after example of God providing for those who are not of the land of Israel. God's care for mankind, not just his care for the Jews. All right, here's the fourth example. The example of Naaman. Now, before you turn to 2 Kings 5, don't do that. I saw Tracy doing it. Don't do that. Don't turn to 2 Kings 5 yet. Stay where you are if you're in Luke chapter 4. In Luke chapter 4 and in verse 27, right after he mentioned the widow of Zarephath and how God provided for that non-Jew, it says in verse 27 of Luke 4, "And many lepers were in Israel in the time of Elisha the prophet, and none of them was cleansed except Naaman the Syrian." None of them was cleansed of leprosy except for Naaman, a heathen, the Gentile. God provided for his cleansing. Did he not care for the lepers who were in Israel? Oh, yes, he did. Oh, yes, he cared for them. But none of them were cleansed of their leprosy like Naaman was. Now let's go to 2 Kings 5. And as we go to 2 Kings 5, notice that there were a lot of things that had to happen. And there were a lot of people who had to act in order for Naaman's cleansing to happen. All right, let's read through this. 2 Kings 5, 1 through 14, and let's do it with this, doing this. Let's point out the characters who are involved and the part that they played. And then let's ask the question, does anybody think that all this came together by accident? And it makes you wonder about some things that happen in our day. And sometimes I think we say, I don't know if that was just an accident. I prayed about it. Was God acting? Did God provide? Was God answering my prayer in this instance? All right, now, did all of this just happen by accident? Look at all the things that had to happen for Naaman to receive his cleansing. 2 Kings chapter 5, verse 1. Now Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great and honorable man in the eyes of his master, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was also a mighty man of valor, but a leper. And the Syrians had gone out on raids and had brought back captive a young girl from the land of Israel. She waited on Naaman's wife. All right, now this young Israelite girl played a key role in hooking up Naaman with the prophet, that he might receive his cleansing. All right, now verse 3. Then she, the young girl, said to her mistress, the wife of Naaman, if only my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria, for he would heal him of his leprosy. And Naaman went in and told his master, saying, thus and thus said the girl who is from the land of Israel. Now wait a minute, who told Naaman? Who told Naaman about that young girl saying that? Well, his wife did. And I think that's the only logical thing that we can say about that. And so now Naaman's wife plays a part in this. Naaman's wife didn't just dismiss it. She could have been very dismissive when this young Israelite girl said, I sure wish Naaman could be with this prophet. I believe he could help him. But she didn't dismiss it. She told her husband about it. She played a role. Then, verse 5, then the king of Syria said, go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel. So he departed and took with him 10,000 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. All right, so now the king of Syria, he plays a part. And then he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which said, now be advised when this letter comes to you, that I have sent Naaman my servant to you, that you may heal him of his leprosy. So the king of Syria played a part, allowed Naaman to go, that he might get with the prophet, and that he might receive this cleansing. And the king of Israel, he cooperates. In verse 7, and it happened when the king of Israel read the letter, that he tore his clothes and said, am I God to kill and make alive, that this man sends a man to me to heal him of his leprosy? Therefore, please consider and see how he seeks a quarrel with me. But eventually then, this king of Israel, he authorized the meeting of Elisha with Naaman, or Elisha's messenger with Naaman. The king of Israel, he signed off on it. All right, now, verse 8. So it was when Elisha played a part, certainly, in the cleansing of Naaman. When Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, that he sent to the king, saying, why have you torn your clothes? Please let him come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. Then Naaman went with his horses with the blessing of the king of Israel. I think that's the idea. Then Naaman went with his horses and chariot, and he stood at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, Now surely Elisha's messenger played part in the cleansing of Naaman, because it was the messenger who gave him the instructions, told him what he must do in order to receive the cleansing from God. So Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, "Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored to you, and you shall be clean." But Naaman became furious and went away and said, "Indeed, I said to myself, he will surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, and wave his hand over the place and heal the leprosy. Are not the Amnon and the Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean?" So he turned and went away in a rage. And his servants came near. Are they going to play a part in his cleansing? And then his servants came near and spoke to him and said, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do something great, would you not have done it? How much more then when he says to you, 'Wash and be clean'?" So he persuaded the servants. They persuaded Naaman that that's what he needed to do. Go to the Jordan River. Act on your faith. So verse 14, so he, Naaman, went down and dipped 7 times in the Jordan. Naaman played part, obviously, in his own cleansing. He went down and dipped 7 times in the Jordan, according to the saying of the man of God. And his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. All right, so you have the young girl doing what she did. You have Naaman's wife cooperating. You have the king of Syria, the king of Israel both cooperating, and so that the meeting can take place. You have Elisha's role, the messenger that was sent to give him the instructions to go to the Jordan River, the servants who persuaded him to do what he was told to do, and then you've got Naaman actually doing it. Well, there's a lot that happened. A series of events occurred, ending up with this leper who was not of the land of Israel being cleansed of his leprosy. Does anybody think that all that came together by accident? Or was the providence of God at work? I suggest to you the providence of God was at work, starting with that little girl, that young girl, taken captive by the Syrians. All right, and then one last example. Real short sermon this morning. Maybe I'll make up for it tonight. This won't take long. But example number 5, Nineveh, the Ninevites. Jonah's attitude, as we turn to the book of Jonah, Jonah's attitude toward Nineveh was a lot different than God's attitude toward them. Jonah did not want those heathen people to be saved. He was a Jew, and he was a patriot, and he wanted that heathen city to be destroyed because Nineveh was the capital city of Assyria, and the Assyrians were fierce, and they were the hated enemies of the Jews. He did not want them to be saved. But God cared about these heathens who had given themselves over to sin. The long suffering of God is shown as he sent Jonah to warn the people of their awful fate. So we pick it up now in Jonah chapter 3, verses 4 and 5. A lot happened before this, but let's pick it up here. Jonah 3, 4 and 5. Jonah preaches to Nineveh. Jonah began to enter the city on the first day's walk. Then he cried out and said, "Yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown." Folks, God had the power to destroy that city. Verse 5, so the people of Nineveh believed God, proclaimed a fast, put on sackcloth, from the greatest to the least of them. Verse 10 says, then God saw their works, that they had turned from their evil way. And God relented from the disaster that he had said he would bring upon them. And he did not do it. Well, he had the power to destroy that wicked city, but he also had the power and the goodness to save those heathen people, those Assyrians. All right, now in Jonah 4, 1 through 4. But it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he became angry. So he prayed to the Lord and said, Oh, Lord, was not this what I said when I was still in my country? Therefore I fled previously to Tarshish, for I know that you are a gracious and merciful God, slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, one who relents from doing harm. Therefore now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live. Then the Lord said, Is it right for you to be angry? He chides him. Is that really right for you to be angry that I'm sparing this city? Well, just for the sake of time, let's drop on down to verse 11. God asked Jonah, And should I not pity Nineveh, that great city, in which are more than 120,000 persons who cannot discern between their right hand and their left, and much livestock? Here we see God's pity, His care, concern, not only for the people of Nineveh, but also their livestock. That's mentioned. God cares for, He is concerned about all of His creation. So we've been talking about God's care for mankind. Those we matter to God. And we need to trust that God cares and that He exercises foresight and control and that He provides for our needs. Maybe we do need to allow the name of God to come from our lips more than we do and give Him credit for what He does. We need to take to heart scriptures like James 5, verse 16. The effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. Do we really believe that? Do we believe what the verses say? We need to take heart 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 12, which says that the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and His ears are open to their prayers. We need to really believe that. We need to believe what John the Apostle said in 1 John chapter 5, verses 14 and 15. Now this is the confidence that we have in Him, that if we ask anything according to His will, He hears us. And if we know that He hears us, whatever we ask, we know that we have the petitions that we have asked of Him. But, you need to be on speaking terms with God, because not everybody is. And it may be that you are here tonight, and you are not on speaking terms with God. You must become His child so that you can address Him as your Father. In John chapter 3, you remember how the Lord told Nicodemus, you must be born again, born of water and of the Spirit. And to be born of water and of the Spirit, I liken that to what Paul said to Titus in Titus chapter 3, verse 5, when he spoke there of the washing of regeneration and the renewing of the Holy Spirit. The washing of regeneration. Regeneration, that is making alive. To regenerate. To make live. So be born again. Be a new creature in Christ. So that now you are a child of God. It may be that you want to act on the teachings of the Scriptures tonight and to become a child of God. And to avail yourself of this blessed privilege of prayer. And being able to look to God every day, believing that He hears you and that He cares. If you're subject to the invitation, come as we stand and sing.